It's early November, 2011, and you and I meet at the bar quite often.
Yeah, we
do. We've done I don't know how many shows here behind this bar, and it's a pleasure to come back to Bloated Toe Enterprises. And I have mentioned that name so many times, and it's all your fault because I have to explain the whole story. And if you know how much I've embellished that original story of you climbing the mountain and getting a bloated toe.
Yeah, well, I told it a lot, though.
But people love it. And you know what? You've been eminently successful. Before the camera started, Larry and I were talking about things we did in our youth and how we somehow either sidestep or abandon our earlier dreams for new dreams. But, you know, that's the way life is. You hardly fish anymore. You hardly climb mountains anymore. You hardly do a lot of things that you love to do, and I'm the same way. But here we are doing things that we love, writing books and talking about books and telling stories. And, you know, even though you're a very humble guy, you have become a very good storyteller.
Well, I didn't really think of it that way in the past, but that's sort of what this book is really for storytellers. You know, it's an accumulation of 51 stories of all sorts about events and places and people across the Adirondacks.
You're going to have to go on the road and tell the stories. It's one thing to write about them and read about them, and you're writing. I mean, here you have this publishing company, you have this thing called Bloated Toe Enterprises, and you insist on writing a few books every year on your own, because you are one crazy guy, Larry Gooley.
Well, yeah, this sort of, this came about, it's kind of a roundabout thing that happened. When you do, you know, you can only really do about one book a year, maybe two a year. It's so time consuming if you're doing other things. And you need ways, if you have a website, to get people to come back to visit your website frequently. And one of the ways suggested so often in the past is to have a newsletter. And at one point, I finally decided to try to do that. So in the newsletter, I would research in old newspapers and find what I thought were really interesting stories that I'd never heard before.
I love them.
And I would write a piece on that, and I did the whole thing in color, and it might have been anywhere from, say, 8 to 12, 14 pages, with old advertisements and all, but it took a lot of work to put it together. So I did this, and it did attract attention, and people kept coming to the website, but as I published more, I was just running out of time to do anything. So after over a year, I finally had to give it up for other things that I was doing. And following up on that, as Facebook became more popular, you keep hearing how businesses should be using social media. And I just didn't really have time for it. And I still don't have time for it, but I try to maintain it somewhat. But we looked at it for about a year or two, and finally I had told Jill at the time to go ahead and, you know, check it out. We should have a presence on there. So when we did that, you start to learn about how it works. And one way to attract people is pretty much the same thing, is to put something on there of interest each day. And Jill got the idea that maybe I could do this day in history. And, you know, I said, well, I'll do it with like a local flavor. So I started to do that. And I rediscovered that I really didn't have time to keep writing because it's so much. You have to actually do the research, and it could take 2 or 3 days to do a story.
Because you are such a stickler for getting it right.
Well, yeah, you don't want to make mistakes. So I was doing that, and I know that I felt like, wow, I'm not going to be able to survive this. But I was into it for not much more than 2 weeks, maybe. And somebody commented on one of the stories, and I didn't know who it was, but he also put a message on there that he wanted to speak with me about something. And I'll fast forward on that. It turned out to be John Warren, who operates Adirondack Almanac. It's the largest online journal in this region. And he also has New York, they call it New York History Blog. There's a lot of serious history written on there. So he wanted me to write for them. And he didn't, as far as regular contributors, it's really hard to do a weekly thing, because to actually find a story and then research it and write it could really consume a whole week. I try to do it within about 2 days or so, because I'm publishing and writing. But I've been doing that since May of 2010, and I'm also contributing to New York History Blog. So as I was doing that, I was writing these stories, and I said, well, I wanted to know, would these actually fit what you're looking for in Adirondack Almanac? And he said, that's exactly what we want. So
I love it.
So instead of doing a book as an accumulation of stories, this was more, I was writing the stories and I was getting to excerpt them on the internet at a popular location where a lot of people, a lot of editors read it. So a lot of these stories have appeared at least partially on Adirondack Almanac. There's 51 main stories. Some actually have a lot of sub-stories to them. But the maybe 5 or 6 largest stories haven't been published anywhere. And actually those 4 or 5, I really consider doing a book of just those 4 or 5 because they're easily as large as the average Adirondack book. But I also wanted to do something different. I wanted to do something that's going to last and that somebody can pick this up and read a 2-page story or a 40-page story, just, enjoy it. And every story dragged me in and then I couldn't escape it. You had to see it through to the end. So I gathered, I probably had 100 at the time to choose from, so I took these 51. And, I had to really rush, of course, the last few months to get it out.
Well, we're doing this in November, and I didn't think you could do it, and I think you could fly across this room if you wanted to. But you killed yourself. Yeah, and came back to life, and here you are with the book published and in the stores.
Yeah, I did. I hate to think I overextended myself, but I was doing about a half dozen books for other people this year.
Oh yes, including me.
And I had kind of shortchanged myself on time, so it took about really almost seclusion for 6 weeks to finish it up and get it into form for the printer. And then I had to kind of work one printing company against the other to say, who can guarantee me this will be back here within 3 to 4 weeks. And I finally got one to, kept squeezing them, and they finally, yeah, we could do it. So they did it. And, I'll be back again.
Well, you have always been fascinated by people and events. You were born and brought up here in the North Country. You have that personal North Country flavor, but you're interested in everything else that goes on around you, especially if it involves history. And Ripley's Believe It or Not would love you because you're always taking the most off-the-wall stuff, starting with your name, Bloated Toe, and turning it into something that's very interesting. So this book should be very popular, and I can see about 15 more in this genre coming up for you in the future, because you really like this stuff, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I used to enjoy reading that kind of book myself because if I was really busy, I could grab it and read a short story. Yeah. That's what I tried to keep most of them short. When you're writing a book, if the final book you sell was 220 pages, it was probably 350 to 400 pages, and you just kept trimming and trimming. So you could get really detailed, and in the end, when you do book signings, you'll have people say, "Well, why didn't you put this in or that?" And well, I took a lot of that out to get it down to this size. But yeah, I see history in a lot of other things that I didn't want to do the traditional Adirondack fare of camping stories and stories of guides and hunting. And I see a lot of other things as history. A person that comes to mind is Eugene Lanford from Louville. I'm just searching through the old newspapers, and I happened to see his obituary. I know, nothing really stood out. But when I read it, I just kind of got the idea that sounds like there's more to this. He worked in Pittsburgh's water system, and I wanted to know a little bit more about him. So I started digging. And it turns out this guy should be one of the North Country's heroes for all the lives he saved over the years. And I consider that history. Either someone who lived here for a long time and was connected to the area, or natives who moved somewhere else and became highly accomplished. Those are people that you sort of claim historically. And in this case, he was born in Louville. And his life was just a good life of doing his job and doing it well. But he developed a way of purifying water when thousands and thousands of people died every year from cholera and different things. And they realized as his career went on how these numbers had dropped incredibly from, thousands dying to only a few every year. And then other cities adopted his way of doing things, and now you'll never know how many, possibly millions of lives he saved. And he's probably unknown anywhere, really.
That's true of a lot of these stories.
Right.
We all, people are always attracted. You mentioned this day in history or today in history. I did it on the radio every day for how many 100 years. and it's in newspapers and so on the radio and on television now. You'll see this day in history. Generally, it's something prominent, something that most of the audience is vaguely familiar with. But a lot of these stories, and more that you have in your head and in your files, are things that nobody ever heard about.
Yeah, I mean, that's one reason I kind of assume they're going to sell, because when I read them, I was fascinated. So that's pretty much what I base it on. If I've never heard of this, and then there's a big story behind it, I just can't wait to keep digging and try to find everything. And you have to you have to access old books. Newspaper archives are critical, and there's a variety of those available. There's all kinds of government records that have now been scanned and that are available. And you can now do books from your home and never actually leave your home doing research. That's pretty much the way it is. And that's where a lot of this comes from. I know, for instance, for me is a place called Steadly Hill. I've been there. I'd been there several times, but I didn't know I'd been there. I saw it on the map, but I wasn't there for that. I was there to canoe the Salmon River and a few of the tributaries. So at different times, I had canoed right next to this hill, not realizing what a great piece of history it was. And then when I discovered it, I thought, wow, this is just amazing. It tied into stories my grandfather used to tell me when cars first became available. He was in Churubusco, and some people had cars, most people had horses. And in Franklin County, it really wasn't clear where cars were going to go, would the average man be able to afford them? So you had to sell cars mostly from the cities and to people who had plenty of money. And, I remember reading about Pikes Peak proving grounds and things like that. Well, turns out that Franklin County actually had their own version of a proving ground. And I had never heard of Steadly Hill. And it was just informal. I read about it a few times. Bootleggers who ran whiskey there. That was one place where you better have horses because a car couldn't climb the hill. It was known for that. It was just so steep that the incline was too much for the cars. Horses would have enough trouble doing it. So eventually somebody had the idea of, that's a good place to test these cars. And when that car would climb Steadly Hill, you'd see it in an advertisement that it had done it, and they would brag it up, and this is going to help sell cars. And that's what it became, and it was a local proving ground, actually in New York State, and it would be a big event where people would gather like on a Saturday or a Sunday to see if these cars could actually make the climb.
People today, you would think, with the communications the way they are these days, instant access on the internet to facts and figures from everywhere, that people would be much more informed than they were in the past. But some people are I find some people are less informed with the internet because they rely too much on it and not the kind of research you do, because they don't sit down and talk with their grandmothers and grandfathers anymore to get some of this history. They don't look over old newspapers. So I'm sure people will pick this book up and read a story and say to their husband, wife, children, grandmother, grandfather, did you know this? And 9 chances out of 10 they'll say no, and that pleases you. On the back of the book are a bunch of bullseyes. What's that all about?
Well, that's a map that shows everywhere there's a red, we call it a red circle or a red ball, is the source of one of these stories. Some of them more than one story. And some of the stories actually break down into 3 or 4. I did some that are really would be considered hard history. It hasn't been written anywhere else, and I think it's something, that was another reason to do this, because these stories are in old newspapers, but they're not really preserved. Nobody's going to really read them except someone like me, or if they're in a book. So I thought some of them should be preserved. So there would be, I did a section on, we were called Rock Eaters on Saturday Night Live.
Oh, yeah.
And,
I
thought that was hilarious. But I was reading through one day about something that had happened in the Adirondacks, and it's always North Country and Adirondacks. So it's Albany North and between Lake Ontario and Lake Champlain. So I got the idea that, wait a minute, we don't, nobody really eats rocks. And I actually researched it and didn't find anybody, but they've eaten just about everything else.
Yeah.
So I did a chapter on that, and it's absolutely amazing to read the things that people have swallowed. And I'm talking North Country people, either by accident or intentionally. And so I did a whole section, a whole chapter just on that. And, I'm laughing through it as I'm writing it. It's just incredible, some of the things that happened. For instance, And this will scare you next time you go to the dentist, but one of them was a dentist drilling, and the drill came loose and the bit went right down the guy's throat. That kind of thing. You know, it's just, yeah.
My gosh.
Yeah, I know, and that's what the stories focus on, is the other end of the story, I might say. So, but there are several like that of people who swallowed things, really unusual things. So.
Just fun, and once you got into it, it became more fun. Of course, it's hard work to put something together like this, because it isn't a matter of picking up somebody else's book, or it wouldn't be the same. You've got to go digging, and as you said, most of these stories are really unfamiliar.
Yeah,
some of the people who live right in these neighborhoods.
Right. The subtitle is New and True: Stories You're Sure to Love, and that's a guarantee. Each one you read, you're going to say, "Oh, well, I never knew that," or "It's amazing." Yeah. But new and true, because they're all my original work. The only things in there that have been published in a book before. This was for a couple of reasons. You know, my mom is a Cherubusco native, Anna Gooley.
Oh yes, we have to say
my biggest fan, and my happy 90th birthday.
Again.
I wanted, you know, Cherubusco really does have an amazing history. I wasn't really sure when I started researching it, but it really does, and I think more people should know about it. So there may be more books like this in the future, but for now, I wanted mostly original work. I took the Adirondack, the Cherubusco Live-In. I included that story. I modified it for the book. I actually increased it. And the other one was Thomas Burke, who was one of the founders of Seattle and the state of Washington. I included, because his is a fantastic story. That should be known across the Adirondack. So I included those two. And one that has partially appeared in another one of my books, but a lot of it didn't, was George Davies from Standish and Lime Mountain. Yeah. You know, he became a very good friend of mine when I was probably 26 or 27 years old. He was 88. But we became good friends, and he told me all these stories, and I did want to use it someday, so this was an opportunity. So out of the 51, that's why the 50 plus, the little plus is for the one
I love
extra,
the cover.
The one extra we threw in there. But the rest of it is it's original work, and it's most of it, it's just things that I have absolutely never heard of, but when I started to find out more, you know, like the guy that's involved in something in Europe, and he becomes famous around the world, and it turns out he's from a little tiny village in the Adirondacks. That kind of stuff really interests me. So that's what I was looking for.
How do you and Jill come up with a cover? For example, that's you know, you and I have talked books lots of times here on television, and certainly when the cameras aren't turned on. And there's so much more to putting a book together, choosing, you know, what's inside and what's outside. And I've learned more from you than I ever dreamed I would ever know about book publishing. So how do you come up with a cover like this?
Well, this one here, I just said I really want it to stand out on the shelf. You know, and in the others, we've had a focus on a subject for a certain reason. But this here, if it's a bad cover, then I'll take full blame for it, because I wanted because it's called Adirondack and North Country Gold, gold meaning 50, and of course we threw in the one extra. So the lettering is in gold, and I wanted a nice big gold 50 on the cover, so that anybody, say if you're at Blue Mountain Lake going through the museum, when you're in the gift shop, that big 50 is going to stand out. It's going to catch your eye. And the red lettering, I thought, added to it as well. So I put together what I wanted, and this time I made the choice, and I had Jill finalize the look for me.
It's something else you and I have discussed, but our viewers may not be aware of it. How do you choose how long you want the book to be? How many pages? That's a critical decision.
Yeah, it is. Each author that I work with learns this along the way. That you know, when I was doing mainly my own books, I was more concerned about my cost. I want to keep my costs down, and books are printed in signatures, they call them, and they're generally multiples of 4, but with more expensive equipment at some of the printing companies, you can do larger signatures. Instead of 8 or 16, you can do 32-page signature. And you'll find that in the end, when you're doing the printing and binding, that will save you money. If your book pages, if you divide it by 32 and you come out with an even 32, that's great. But if there were 4 or 5, or say 5 extra pages, from that 5, they would have to go up to 8. A multiple of 4, so you're going to have 3 blank pages. And when you're paying for the pages, you start thinking, couldn't I use those pages for something? So now when I put a book together, I had this one in rough draft form, and then I looked at it, and if it had maybe 375 pages, and I had some trimming to do. So I knew eventually, like maybe 11 signatures around, that one's 352. I was probably at 360 at the time. So I didn't need all the front matter that I had. Some front matter are actually blank pages anyway. So I trimmed it down to hit that number and make it less expensive for me, and then I can keep the price down. Because one thing that that really bothers me about some modern publishing that's going on, it's misleading to me in the sense that, say you go shopping now and you buy a jar of mayonnaise and you realize the price is still the same after 4 or 5 years. That's great, but you don't realize that they've dropped it maybe from 12 ounces to 9 ounces or something.
Oh, sure.
You're getting less for your money. Well, the trend now is you'll see, I know more about the internal parts of a book because I'm the one putting it together, so I'll know word count for one thing. Now, some of the books you'll see are actually 1.5 or double spaced. Now, that's a lot fewer words in a book, and there's a lot of what we call white space in a book. Like, I do like the content of the Arcadia books. I liked all the pictures that they put in them.
Oh, yes.
Really great historical pictures. But when I look at them, I see a picture, and all the rest of the page is white, and that's all just wasted space to me. If you're paying for the space, use it. But they're not paying for the space. They're saying, we'll take whatever you give us, and we'll print it for you. And I don't do that. If somebody gives it to me, I'm going to look at it and say, write something about this picture or add another picture. Fill the space. Use it, you know. So that's what a lot of the books now do. And I didn't bring samples to show, but this book is actually it's larger than probably 3 of the average Adirondack books that they're selling right now for about $20. I'm retailing this for $26. But those books actually have, a lot of them have 120 pages and they're 1.5 space, so they're actually like 20,000 or maybe that many words. This has over 100,000 words in it. This is really packed from beginning to end.
It really is. So I wanted people to know that there's a lot more that goes into publishing and printing a book than just writing the words down and putting them inside covers. Because you and I have been interested in books all of our lives, and many of our viewers have too. And you know, we remember reading books when we were a kid where the print was so tiny and they jammed so much in a page.
Yeah.
And a 500-page book was a 500-page book back then. Nowadays, you could never get away with that. But you have to choose formats that are interesting and pleasing to people. And every time I come and talk to Larry, he picks up a book, either his own book or somebody else's, and we discuss how the book is put together. And I say, oh, I never thought of that. I never thought. So the size of the type.
That's another thing with
the actual font.
Yeah, a lot of the books you're going to see right now in the Adirondacks are actually they're just over the minimum you need to have a spine on the book. And then what they'll do is they leave a lot of white space, and they'll use 12-point text, which is, a lot of people use it, but if you shrink it to 11, like this book here it's 352, it probably would have been 380 pages if it was 12-point font. But 11 is, I find, easily readable.
I think more people are aware of what that means now, thank goodness, because of the internet and computers.
Yeah,
and
I guess, yeah. I didn't know either, really. But it's really just the size of the lettering and the closeness of it. And you don't want it to be too crowded.
Just to prove a point about a picture on a page with writing around it.
Yeah, that's another thing. You know, I'm creating it so I can take a picture. If it's not quarter page or half page, you can build the text around it. That's one of the anchor stories. The reason the illustrations aren't great is because that story is just, you know, it's not that old really. It's from the 1950s, but that's one of my anchor stories. The book actually has 4 what I would call anchor stories, and Garrett Cashman is one of them. I discovered that, I was reading about it one day about this guy who just, he lived in Albany, and one day some people look up and see this thing floating across the sky, you know, and to me it would be like, holy cow, what is that? But to a lot of them it was, call the police. Now, I don't know why that's your first reaction. But that was their reaction.
Yeah, 911, here we go.
Yeah. So here's a guy that's just floating across the sky. They didn't really know what it was, but I don't know what they thought it was. But he was actually history's second cluster balloonist. he got this idea that he wanted to fly, and had been in his head for a long time. And it would take when he finally did his first flight, it was weather balloons. He had some might be 6 or 8 foot diameter. He purchased a bunch of those. He had them inflated and enough to lift his body weight and his seat and everything else he had with him. And not really knowing for sure what was going to happen, he had a good idea, but still, once you went up there, you floated with the wind. So he went up and floated across the city of Albany, and everybody was going crazy. So the way his story started is the state police were also following him, and when he finally came down, he was arrested because he's got to be breaking some kind of law flying like that. But actually, those are still the days when America could be more inventive, more creative, and he became a folk hero, really, in the Albany area. But that wasn't enough for him. He wasn't doing it to be a folk hero. He became a national sensation, really. He was on national television, but he was more concerned about, at first, the idea that I want to fly, and I want to fly with balloons. So he actually just had this cluster of balloons overhead that carried him, and then when you're
makes you want to sing up and away, doesn't it?
Yeah, and now you figure
it.
you're 2 miles up in the air, and you've got to come down, so you just start popping balloons. That's what he did. He would actually be sitting in his seat and using a slingshot, and he'd keep breaking balloons because at times he started to go so high he really didn't know what was going to happen. So I eventually researched his life story, and he was involved in so many other things. I mean, national beauty pageants, dog pageants, that was all part of his later life. But this story's never been told before. It was covered in the Albany newspapers. And I do consider
it's
part
like
of
a great story.
It's a North Country story, but the strongest tie to the North Country is when he had to get his license. And this wasn't, this is only the 1950s, and they were still pretty open to this, flying for people doing things on their own, being inventive, creative. Yeah. And it was encouraged. So the FAA or different groups looked at him and they said, well, okay, well, you've got to have a license. That's all. That's our problem. So he had to get his license. And a couple of failed flights, because when he went to do it was in a really windy place, which isn't great for control of these little balloons. So finally his successful flight was in the Adirondacks. He went up into the Old Forge area, and they were there to watch him lift off. And it was kind of a neat story too, because when he lifted off, he had to prove he could control it. So he goes flying up in the air, but then he has to come back down. So the way he did it, he lowered himself right to where he's skimming the water, and he says, filled up my shoes with cold water. I think this was in November. It was late in the year.
Oh, good.
September or sometime late in the year. So it was pretty cold. But anyway, he did that, and once he knew they were satisfied, off he went, and then he disappeared. And for most of the day, they thought he died somewhere. They didn't know where he was. Airplanes went looking for him, and they couldn't find him. And he was finally seen like thousands of feet up in the air, and he eventually landed safely. And so I go on to tell his whole life story. It's just, to me, I was totally fascinated.
How somebody could live through all these experiments, I mean.
Oh, and you know what happened with this? Just, you never know what's going to happen when you start doing something. The people you're going to meet. So I did this story, and I did a version of it in my old newsletter, and that's from years ago. I think it was about 2 years later, I get a contact from a guy, and I recognized the name, though, because I had done a little more research on cluster ballooning. It's rare that anybody does it, but some people are really famous for doing it. And this one guy named Jonathan Trapp contacted me, and I thought the name sounded familiar, and he really praised the story, and he thanked me so much for doing it. And then I looked up who he was, and when you look up Jonathan Trapp, it's with PPE. He's one of the most famous cluster balloonists in the world, and he was very friendly in the contact, and we didn't stay in touch, but it's something I'm not going to forget, obviously. Well, I get a contact a couple of years past that, and it's a guy writing for Smithsonian Air and Space magazine.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, like, what did he want with me? But he loved the story on Garrett Cashman, and what happened was Jonathan Trapp, I think this was sponsored by Smithsonian. I'm not sure if National Geographic was involved, but Smithsonian anyway. He's going to do the first cluster balloon flight across the English Channel. And the writer that was assigned to cover it contacted me and wanted to know more about Garrett Cashman, because he had something on each person in the history of cluster ballooning, but almost nothing on Cashman. And I had pretty much everything on him. So some of these pictures I loaned him appeared in, he ran the article, he credited me, and he actually went over there. He helped, he was involved in loading and inflating the balloons and everything.
No kidding.
And following the flight from England over to France, just to me, or to the mainland.
Yeah, there's a picture, for example. How did you come across this
Yeah, the pictures, I do mention in the beginning of the book that some of the pictures are not of the quality I would have liked, but I'm doing a story, and really I want to illustrate the story. And sometimes the only thing available is old newspapers. And these are old newspapers that have been put into electronic format, and I'll try to secure a copy of it the best I can, and that's about as good as they're going to look. There's really not a lot you can do to make them better.
Nobody would complain about that because it adds so much to the story itself.
Yeah,
and you know, when you're talking about this, all of a sudden people are sitting at their television sets or wherever they're watching this saying, so that's what cluster ballooning is all about. How many cockamamie tales have we seen about through the years of people who get loaded and get on their lawn chair and then put 500 small balloons on there and get off the ground and crash and break their arms and legs and...
Well, that's the way the media tells the story. Usually there's a lot more to it. You know, there are a few guys, one did it in the 1980s, and he became famous for getting in his lawn chair and flying, for like 50 or 60 miles. So a few of them have done it. And then when you backtrack through it, the guy that was doing the research wanted to know who the original was. And there was a connection that I had a heck of a time finding, and through all the research I did, it took forever, and finally one tiny little mention cracked it for me. Because a lot of it's a question of, are you searching with the right terms?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I was always a Star Trek fan, and it happens to be that the first cluster balloonist was this guy named Picard, and that's where they got the name for the captain of the Enterprise. So this Picard guy was the first one to do it, and he was an engineer. He was deadly serious about this. He was doing very important research, and then I did finally find the connection that before Cashman went up, he was in contact with Picard down in, I think it was in Pennsylvania, and he actually was supposed to go there and fly with him. So he planned this. It did seem like it was sort of an off-the-cuff thing, but in the other cases where people tried it, it really wasn't, because most likely you're not going to survive it.
Well, he tried so many things, though. I mean, he did this for a long time, right?
Yeah.
He did. I saw where you wrote that he tried wings.
Yeah, he actually had a picture in there of him he thought, well, if I'm up there, if I had some wings, maybe I could maneuver myself. That didn't really work out very well, but, realizing how much fun this is, but how expensive it is, too. So, he didn't really seem to do it for publicity, but it became... say a newspaper or someone would say, hey, we could use you for advertising. The circuses hired him for advertising. He advertised for some of the earliest NASCAR races down in Daytona.
So he did make a couple of bucks off of that.
He eventually went all over the country. They hired him as a front man to promote. In fact, that picture you showed, that's what he's doing. He's in a city somewhere promoting the circus is coming in about a week. And he did this all across the country. And eventually was sponsored by different companies, and I think Pepsi was involved at some point, and then he made the switch from there to beauty pageants, which were sponsored by Pepsi, like Miss America, things like that. So that's what I did. I covered his whole...
He was somewhat of an entrepreneur as well as being a daredevil. Did he ever break bones?
And he got scraped up a little bit on some of his landings.
I would think so.
And some of the stories that would probably sound embarrassing when he came in to land, he would do a lot of events, like a big race or a big public event somewhere in the Albany area. And they would hire him, and he'd come in. He's going to do his flight, his little exhibition. And at one point, he landed in a tree, and you'd think, boy, if you're a guy flying, that's just embarrassing. But there's no better publicity than that, because that story went coast to coast immediately. Everybody knew about him, and right away, some are laughing, some are saying it's amazing, and advertising companies are saying we could use that guy, and that's what happened to him.
But people come up with these odd schemes, odd ways of doing things.
Yeah.
Excuse me for coughing. There's so many bugs going around.
Yeah.
Goodyear Blimp.
Huh?
Goodyear Blimp.
The Goodyear Blimp.
That's right.
Exactly right. And how, just the history of ballooning and the fact that, as most of our viewers know by now, I have an actual piece of the Hindenburg, so I'm very close to this lighter-than-air thing. And I've read a lot of these stories. Yours is the best. It's not just enough to gather the information and to tell the story. You have to write it in a way that is interesting and appealing, and you have a natural talent for that.
I don't know about that.
What you've been developing ever since you were a small child. No, I mean, you've written a lot of books. This is 10 now?
This is number 10, yes.
Number 10, not that we're counting.
Right.
Yeah, this is number 10. And, it's the old story, I'm going to do it till I get it right. But your first books are still popular, so you doing it right when you started.
Well, I wasn't sure. I just knew I wanted to do it. So the Line Mountain thing actually turned out better than I imagined.
Better than
because,
anybody imagined it would.
you know, because I saw the recent show with about the Clinton Community College book, and I think they said they did 500 copies. I initially did 1,000 of the Line Mountain book, and there were only 438 people living in the village. But I ended up selling all of 1,000, so knowing that I would never sell that many again, I printed 1,500 or 500 more. But I sold all those. So
I love it.
So now it's a guarantee you're never gonna. So I did 500 more, but we sold all those. And now since then, that was 2004. I began. It's become a lot more expensive in some ways. So I wanted to reduce. I changed that book just to reduce the size of mainly some of the photos, to reduce the size of the book, but all the content is there. And I don't remember if I did 300 or 500, but now I'm fearing I made another mistake. I should have printed more because it's still selling every week. We sell some.
It's an important local topic. Everything you write about, as far as I'm concerned, are important local topics. And let's reiterate, if not regurgitate, some of the stuff we talked about before. Your story with the serial killer Robert Garrow. You knew that was going to be a popular book, but did you know that people would attach to it on such a broad scale? And to me, the sales of that book are amazing.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, I'd never brag about anything. At home, I would just tell Jill that
that's what we're here for. 'Cause
Well,
I love that book.
when I was writing it, I was just telling her that, you know, I've read a lot of Adirondack books, including the one about Chester Gillette, and I just said, I think this is one like you would call an instant classic. I think this is going to sell. And rather than do 500, I said, I think I'm going to do a couple thousand because it's going to sell and it's going to keep selling year to year. And, you know, it's hard because it's very expensive at first to do it. But once you sell and earn back what you put into it, then it's profit. But if you have to reprint, you've got to pay out again. And that can be, it's a lot less expensive to guess right the first time. If you knew you're going to sell 4,000, or say the Line Mountain book, if I had printed 2,500 in the beginning, it would have increased my profits dramatically. But you're also investing a lot of money not knowing. So with that book, I did 2,000, which for an Adirondack book, that's a pretty good number, especially when you're selling it yourself, not through stores. But we went through that in a year. So I knew, you know, before the year was up, I already had to reprint. So it's, it got to where the stores that carry it, and a lot of stores don't carry my books, a lot of the stores just got me on their reorder list. And they're ordering in, say, in July they'll order 24, in August they'll order 24. So, you know, if you sit home and think about it, you say, wow, like, every day one person went in that store and bought my book, so you know they're moving pretty well. But it is something you have to know, for business reasons. You have to know this is going to keep happening.
After all these years of studying and writing and selling, it's still, a lot of it's a crapshoot, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it is. It's that's one, you know, like one of my criticisms of the way books are going now. E-books really, for me, are just nothing to worry about because people expect to buy an e-book for a few dollars. And if you're going to produce this for a few dollars, you better have a couple of jobs because this is just a hobby, really. You're not going to sell a lot of them.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of companies out there who publish. Blurb is one of them. I know like Mark Merrow's books were done through that, and I've seen a couple of others. And the problem is those, you know, you can do a really nice job. There's no question you can do a nice job. But those businesses were really meant as gifts. Like my son has sent me a book of my granddaughter's first year or second year of life, and that's what you do. You send the materials, you have it done through a company like that. So one book might cost you anywhere from $20 to $50. But to really sell any volume of books, you know, if you want to sell more than 100 or a couple hundred copies, you need to pay in advance to print, and it's much less expensive per copy. It's an investment. I might invest anywhere from, let me see, just as far as just cash for printing, we're not talking about anything else. Just for the printing and binding part, you might invest anywhere from $3,000 to $8,000 if you're doing 500 to maybe 2,000 or 3,000 copies.
People are astounded when I tell them that. People have of course they don't know. If you haven't written a book and tried to get it published yourself or even through a publishing company, you don't know.
Right, but when you look at it that way, you might say, well, wait a minute, then it only costs really $3 or $5 to print this book, and yet you're selling it for $20 or $25, so that's a huge profit. Well, it might be a pretty good profit on one book, but you've got to sell you need to sell several hundred just to get most of your investment back. And then it's just probably going to be a trickle effect. And you realize that you invested that today. You might not see it back for, it depends how fast you sell, but it might be a year or two for some people. For some, they don't get it back because what those companies do is, it's not, I wouldn't say they're unethical. From my point of view, it's unethical because, they are telling you the truth. You can publish your book through us, but they're not telling you that was the easy part. The hard part is you're going to have to go out and sell these books. And you would think, well, yeah, but I don't have much money invested, and that's true, and you can't lose much, but you also can't make much, and you aren't going to get your book to very many people. To some people it might be important to write a book, but if I wrote a book and only sold 100 or 200 copies, what was the point?
That's why they call it vanity press.
Really?
Because it's a vanity thing. People say, oh, I wrote a book.
Right. No, I've looked through both of Mark Merrill's books, and I like the content. It's just something that, similar to the book you did, I could do that book, and you could say maybe invest $5,000 to $7,000. You'd be selling the book for $20,000 to $25,000. You might clear eventually within a year or two. You're going to probably make anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000, and if you're a retired person, that's money you can just put into the next book, and you can do more and more. And that's why I think these companies really should be upfront more. I have a person just contacted me about publishing for them, and just really looks like terrible business sense on my part to tell them, well, if you do this, you're going to want to sell your book through stores. But what you won't know from these companies is that almost no store will carry your book unless you discount it 40%. And if you want to sell through the stores, say Barnes & Noble, that are still available in, say, for upstate New York, Saratoga area, a lot of people. If you can sell in that store, you have potential to do pretty well. And they'll tell you, wow, that book looks pretty good, but they won't buy it from you. They want to buy it only from a distributor. And the distributor will only buy your book. The best one you're going to find up here is 55% off. So that book that you were selling for $25, you suddenly have to sell to someone for about $11. And they're making $10. You're only making a few dollars a copy at that point. And that's something that people need to know. So some stores won't carry my books because I won't discount them as much as the traditional discount of 40%. Because if I do, I won't be in business. So I found places to sell where I don't have to discount at 40%.
So sometimes when you talk to people, and Calvin and I spent a lot of time talking about you and promoting you because you're one of our favorite people. We like what you're doing. We like not only the books that you're writing, but what you're doing for other people as well. That's why you call it Bloated Toe Enterprises. Sometimes as time goes on, you have to revise your hopes and dreams and see what you want to focus on. Yeah. You're one of those rare people that has enough energy to write 10 books and run a company at the same time. And it's not all dire necessity. It's just something that you're having a ball with.
Yeah.
Until the day when you only get 15 minutes sleep instead of an hour and a half. Yeah. But you are having a good time with this, Larry.
I always like learning. That's one of the biggest things. So now I'm able to learn every day, and I'm still trying to make money at it. That was the key, because you can learn every day by sitting home and reading, but you need to have an income too. And you need to know things like this person that just wrote to me again this morning. You need to know that if a company will even self-publish your book at a good price, they should be telling you that now you have to go out and sell it. If you don't have a marketing or a degree in marketing or selling or anything like that, this is all new to you, and you don't know what to do, really. And most people aren't going to be able to do it. You simply won't know what to do. But they don't tell you that. And that's one thing that, I can make more money at this by just getting someone like you to say, I can publish that for you. Here you go at $5 a copy, and it's your book to sell. But then you're not going to be very happy a year later when you've only sold 100 copies and you've got what I call doorstops at home. You've got stacks and stacks of books everywhere.
Well, and many people choose to do it that way just because, as we said before, it's a vanity thing. They want to publish a book. Right. You're serious with this business. You're learning. You're still learning.
Oh, every day.
Even though you've been in this business, when did Bloated Toe start?
November 2004.
Doesn't seem like long, but it's 7 years, right?
Yeah, and we are still around. Which some of the companies I originally ordered books from, they're gone. I didn't realize. I tried to contact them recently, and I didn't know they're not publishing anymore.
The whole status of publishing on every level in the country has changed so much in the last 5 years as to astound you and frighten you. Because, you know, we're newspaper lovers, always read lots of newspapers, we're magazine lovers.
Mm-hmm.
I used to subscribe to as many as 10 or 15 magazines myself, because I'm one of those voracious readers, and if I don't have a book in my hand, I'm not happy walking to the bathroom or even in the store. You know, because if I'm tied up for 15 minutes, I want to be able to open the book and read another one of Larry Gooley's 50-plus stories about the Adirondack region. So I'm interested in it.
Well, this is something actually we're going to go, well, I would say we're supporting it and not so much promoting it. This coming weekend is the Chronicle Book Fair down in Glens Falls.
Oh, that's right. Now, remind people again, I'm talking with Larry Gooley of Bloated Toe Enterprises in Plattsburgh, and we're doing this on the second day of November, and these programs are always aired far into the future, often of the time we record them. But in November, there will be a book fair.
Yeah, and actually this is one of the, this is the biggest one in the region for certain. I'm not sure if it's their 16th, maybe 17th year. It's at the Queensberry Hotel, which is, you know, beautiful, huge rooms with chandeliers. It's just a great place to go. And they'll have, usually they'll say over 100. It's 100 to 120 authors, publishers, booksellers, bookstores might go. It could be anyone who just did their first book and wants some attention, and it could be someone who's done 30 books or more. It depends on, you know, depends on your interest. And for different prices and at very low prices, you can set up an 8-foot table. We'll have an 8-foot table because we have so many books. And you sell books all day, you visit with people, you sign autographs. The nice email that I got, because I was trying to push for this, because last year I was one of the more, ended up being the popular thing at that book fair, because as word spread about the Garrett book, people were flooding into the room, and we sold an awful lot of books that day. It was 5 hours nonstop action. So
That's great.
I really don't want to promote myself, but in that case, because
of course you do.
Well,
I know what you mean, though. I know what you mean.
I'm pretty busy behind the scenes, but for this fair, I did tell her that I do have a new book that I was trying to get a promise from the printer that I would have it. Finally, I got the guarantee, and I told them, I said, this is going to be a really good seller. It's going to be a popular book, and it's across the Adirondack. People will love it. So I pushed them a little bit. But anyway, I got an email a couple of weeks ago with all the preliminary information, and one of the guests, the special guests, I'm not sure of the name, though. I'll probably get this wrong. The fabulous Beekman boys or Beekman brothers. They've become a big sensation here with two guys running this farm in upstate New York. And then there's another guy that's really popular in western New York. And these are the special guests. But when she sent the list, she says, by the way, I want to make sure you know that you're on the A list of authors. So when she sent the list, they listed me with the new book and, of course, with the serial killer book. So we'll be going there this weekend. You don't really know what to expect because so much has happened with the world of books, but this is supporting printed books. That's one thing I do like. Instead of the media, instead of electronic books, this is people who are serious about print.
I'm a fan, and someday I might own an ebook reader,
Me too.
but I don't now. And here we are in an age where everybody's making them now. You know, there was one maker for a while, and they're getting better and better, but I don't know, and it's not just that I'm old and I'm old school, but I'm a book lover, and I love to hold books. I love to feel the books. I feel as though maybe I can get more of a sense of the author than I can through something that's printed. That's why I like to talk to people in person rather than on the telephone.
I know, it's something about technology too. When the capabilities first came out to download music online, and, you know, we both just love music. So friends of mine at work said, you know, I've got 1,500 songs, I've got 2,000 songs. Now, I like a lot of songs, but when you really think about 2,000 songs, you're just not going to listen to most of them. It's become a collecting thing, which I've done myself on the internet.
Oh,
so
you're talking to the guy who invented it.
Well, this is the same thing with books. You know, they'll say, well, you can buy this e-reader and you can store 1,000 books on it. Well, go ahead and tell me 1,000 books that you've read or are going to read. People are collecting them. But mostly what you're getting, I mean, a lot of them are great books. They're classics because companies like Amazon can take anything that is off copyright, printed before 1923, and they can print it and sell it. So when you shop on Amazon now, you'll see a title that was printed in 1880. Now, they don't actually have it most likely, but they're saying they do, and they'll say, here's the price, you know, like $19, you can buy one. and then they'll get one printed up if you're going to order one, or they'll just say out of stock. But that's what they're claiming. They have all this stuff because those are available, but people are collecting it. I would never sell this for $3. There's just no way. You've got a year's work in there, and I remember, go back to Mark Merrill's comment about I'm not making any money on all this.
Yeah.
Well, that's part of the problem. That company's making money when really Mark could make a nice profit from those books, and somebody is going to be making the profit. Either that or they're not going to sell. And that's why the risk is involved of spending more, I just approached someone about it, and I said, well, you realize you're getting into, you have to market this yourself. You have to go out and do appearances. You have to hope people are going to come to see you. And you have to invest probably in this person's case, maybe $6,000 to $8,000. Of course, if you sell 1,000 copies, you're going to do very well. And, there's the other side of it. It can be a lot of fun. If you're a public person and you love having people ask to have their picture taken with you and ask for your autograph and please personalize it, and people actually leave their homes to come to see you, that does, you've been through this. It feels, you have a responsibility. It feels kind of strange. But, when I go down there, I know it's documented, it's happened. It's just an odd feeling because I'm not in it for that. I just like to do it, and I wanted to do
It's
something
part of
I
the whole
like.
picture, and now you have inserted yourself in the fabric of the North Country in ways you probably never dreamed you would when you were 15 years old. But you're doing it on a grander scale all the time because you can. I mean, doing what you do now would have been impossible 30 years ago. You never could have accomplished the research with early computers.
No.
Now there's so many resources available, and with many old newspapers online,
Right.
It makes it better. I mean, I've done research all my life for one reason or another, and I have spent, very bleary-eyed 8-10 hours, with microfiche readers
God,
and
yes.
libraries and colleges and trying to find information that I can find now in 22 seconds just by going like that.
Right, because online makes it so much different. For books, say for stories like this, you can't go to the source because there is no the source. There is no public document on it. There's no official federal or state document because it might just be a story of a place like Steadly Hill or for instance, the one on Polka Moonshine. I was amazed when I found that story. Now there were actually some state documents on that because it's in the state record that there was a push to have that mountain carved into the likeness of our first governor.
Yeah.
And so in that case there are, and you should search for those. But otherwise, the main source for most people is going to be old newspapers, and they really don't have perfect search engines. When you're searching, one person might search for days and not find it, but if you can find the right keyword, because my attitude is the information's there somewhere, and
that's essential. There are a lot of different search engines, some better than others, and you have to be willing to noodle around. But
Yep.
getting the right information has been true since the internet was invented.
I'm doing
right?
something right. Yeah, I'm doing something right now. A book on murders in the North Country, and again by North Country, Albany North, and between the lakes. So, and the Chester Gillette story is one of the really famous murder stories.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to have, I was hoping for 50, but I think the book will be too large. But it'll be at least 25 stories, and every single one is as twisted and convoluted as that one, with just remarkable turning points. And one of them that I was covering, another author just covered in a book, and it was in one of those really thin books that I don't care too much for.
Yeah, we can tell.
But I said, well, I never know. You're kind of like working in a vacuum all the time.
Yeah.
You're doing this yourself, and I really don't, my mom will tell me she liked the story, but other than that, I'm just on to the next story. So last night, I stopped to read what this person wrote, because one of their chapters is the same as the story that I wrote. And everything that this person wrote is from newspapers, and a lot of it is erroneous, because when I collect stories, on that particular one, I think I probably had 80 or 100 newspaper articles, old articles. Now that's a lot of reading, because you might have 5,000 words, and you've got a lot of reading to do. Well, you'll find when you use old newspapers for things like that, a lot of them get it very, very wrong. I mean, way, way off.
Modern newspapers do the same thing.
You have them where a guy is dead.
Yeah.
And tomorrow you find out, oh no, he's not dead. But if you use that article, well, that's what this person did. And a lot of the information in that story is simply not true. The guy that wrote it, and the tendency back then is and I suppose today by some is to embellish. Because, well, you wrote a good story, but go on the internet, it's a fantastic headline, and when you read the story, it's nothing like what the headline promised, because they're just trying to embellish to get you to go there. And unfortunately, that's being included. I'm trying really hard to avoid that, and that means you have to find basically everything ever written about that subject and then trim it down until you get the story. And it's one thing that's very helpful in doing stories like that, though, is that in, say 100 years ago, it was common for you as a reporter to go to a local murder case and write everything in the newspaper. All the testimony appears in the newspaper in very, very small print, and then you've got to wade through that if you can read it.
Sometimes, day after day after day, week after week.
Day by day, yep.
Just read the old New York Times.
Right.
Yeah.
Because in the Robert Garrett story, I just happened to have access to the actual record. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had that because they don't do that anymore.
Your job in that book alone is incredible, and you may not want to blow your own horn, as my father used to say, but I'll blow your horn for you. It's a rare treat to see a book like that, because I know how much energy you put into it. I also know how careful you are when you're doing your research, and I can't say that enough. There are some people who still believe if they see it in print, it must be true. And that couldn't be farther from the truth, especially when you're trying to glean information from the internet, from any source, never mind just from newspapers.
Yeah.
So you gotta throw it up in the air and see what comes down and hope that it sticks.
That is really, with 100 newspaper, the Garrett book I had over 800. And you need to absorb everything that every writer wrote. And the guy that wrote something different stands out, so you have to make sure he was wrong. You have to make sure that he's the one that made the mistake. Because once in a while you get that reporter, some of these guys, you have to know who they are. And they had friends that would let them see things. We had one guy that actually was allowed in before everyone else to just come on in and take a look at Garrett's cell because he's such good friends with the authorities there. And he got to see everything as it was laid out. And he wrote about it. And that's something, it's special for him. So,
it's more difficult now than it used to be, and I can speak from years of experience in the radio business, knowing people in high places, and because we live in the North Country, I had access to scenes and information that nobody else did because they were symbiotic relationships between me and the people I worked with.
Exactly.
And I never stuck it to anybody on purpose so that I had that source the next time I needed it. These are no big secrets, but it's changed so much now. You don't have that kind of access anymore because all the agencies pretty much run scared.
Yeah.
So you have to be really lucky or really old or really persistent to get information. So it's even harder for you now than it would have been, say, 30 years ago.
If I was doing a story like that. Among the anchor stories in here, I had a couple that I've just been, mesmerized by, 3 of them especially for the last several years, and just knowing they have to be in a book at some point. And I would consider doing booklets, actually, because it's such a tremendous story. I was doing something on a guy up in the Plattsburgh area, and I saw the name William Elks, and he was a speed walker. He's back then. This is before sports really hit it big in America. Anything was a sport, and walking was, it is now. But it was a thing you would do. Like, we get done working tonight at 6 o'clock. You and I are going to go out there and we're going to walk, and we're going to walk 3 miles. And whoever goes the fastest, everybody's placing bets, and this is how it went. And you made pretty good money at this if you were good. And this Elks guy was pretty good. So I started, just on a whim. I thought, I wonder if there's more. So I found more, and I found more on this guy. But eventually, the real story was his son. And I didn't know it at the time. So I researched and I followed this Elks guy, and he actually became he called himself, he was a painter by trade, and he painted houses in Keysville. He lived there for a while. He worked in Plattsburgh, and he toured all over in running and walking competitions. And he eventually ended up down in the Saratoga area, and he loved just the physicality of everything so much. He decided he was a trainer. So he starts training people, and he eventually, I think it was at Hamilton College, he coached them to the state championship one year, athletics. So now, he's got that going for him, and I'm not even knowing at that point that the real story is his son, but he's got this young son, and one of his boys died, and he probably paid a little more attention to the other one at that point. And one thing that Bill Elks would do, besides he would walk race, he would run, he'd bike, he'd skate, anything. And he did this everywhere. back then, when trains came in, you could suddenly travel to certain points. So you could leave Plattsburgh and you could compete in New York City.
Sure.
He starts going down to New York City in Madison Square Garden. There's a big race at the end of the year. He'll get in and roller skate against the best skaters in the country. So he did things like this, and he became more familiar with everything, which was very important because his son started riding bicycle. He's from the Glens Falls area, and he rode in Warrensburg, but mainly Glens Falls. And he was very good as a young boy, as a teenager, but then he went through the tough times of competing with the big boys, but he had all those little breakthroughs, and it kept happening. Well, he goes on to become a world champion, and his life story is just, I was absolutely amazed just to read it, let alone put it together. And it took a long time to put it together because it's a gigantic story. And that became one of the anchor stories. Because I thought it was going to be William Elks, but it turns out really he's part of the story of his son's story.
Good genes there, huh?
Yeah. The other one was also from the Glens Falls area. One of them was born in Port Henry, actually. There's an awful lot of history in Crown Point and Port Henry.
We're learning that, aren't we?
Another one that I had written to a guy in Glens Falls about was a speed walker. And in fact, he knew Elks because of this, because the dad was involved in that. But this guy, if you like sports, like I like sports, then it became incredible. Like, is he ever going to lose? Because he was so good, and what you'd have to do back then is once you became good, people never really knew how good you were because they would handicap you all the time. So after he won so many races, they'd say if someone defeated you, it might be because, well, you walked 3 miles and they only walked 2. That's what you had to do. Well, he kept beating everyone, so now he starts racing against horses and everything you could think of. At county fairs, it was big appearance money. And again, this guy became a fantastic champion, just like unheard of. These are 2 of the best athletes in North Country history. And yet a few years ago, well, I heard of them a few years ago through research, but other than that, I've never seen anything about them. Beautiful gravestone to one of them in Glens Falls Cemetery, too. So hopefully that's going to help with this book in the coming weekend down in Glens Falls.
We're excited about some of these stories, and I hope that's exactly the purpose of doing this program, is so people say, are you kidding? I never heard of that guy. He wrote about old-time motorcycles, bike racing, and early motors on motorcycles. Some of those guys, they had to lose their lives to further the sport.
I'm like you, just what you said. Are you kidding? I say that every day, and then that becomes a story. When you start digging and you need to find, the hard part is you need to find beginning to end. I don't like to miss anything, and that can be very difficult.
Oh, yeah, but that's why you have this passion. Yeah. You have the passion and the desire to do it right, but you're developing an expertise that's pretty hard to match anywhere else, and I like that. But I also like what you do for other people like me and for others, because you published how many books for other people now?
We've done our 19th recently. This is number 19. I could have done more. Like I said, I do tend to discourage some people. I want them to know what is going to be involved.
It's hard to discourage some people.
Well, yes, but I don't want to. If they don't make money at it, I want them to have known going in how hard it was going to be. So, but 19 plus, I've got 3 or 4 that are in the beginning stages right now. I kind of got away from it for a month or 2 to finish this up, and at some point I need to stop and go out.
Well, we're not talking about a staff of thousands at Bloated Toe Enterprises. We're not talking people who look at the websites these days. Very flashy websites, think, wow, this is a factory. You got 200 people here. You got lots of people editing. You got lots of no, it's almost a one-man band here.
Right. I saw the difference the other day. We ordered some books because we do sell through our online store. And Christmas should be your big selling time. So we ordered books by several regional authors. And when the books came in, you flip through them right away, and when you've been doing this for a while, you begin to realize as you flip through it and you see bright white paper and great big letters and lots of space, that's what I would tell an author, try to avoid that. But if you go through a lot of the online companies, that's what you're going to get. Yes, I could take this book, I can submit it to any of a number of companies, which I've done in the past, and they'll say we can We can have, in a month, we can have 500 copies in your hands for so many dollars per copy. But the problem is, when you get it, it doesn't look like a real professional book, you know? It is a book in form, but when you look at it, you do see the difference.
There's so many pitfalls, and people
Yes.
writing, they think they're good writers. Somebody handed me some manuscript yesterday to look and see if it was something that I would suggest them submitting to Larry Gooley for publishing. And I read 2 pages, and I said, how do I tell this person? This is terrible.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about editing and more about this particular book and other things you do as we continue our great program with Larry Gooley at Bloated Toe Enterprises. And you know, as you and I are talking here, of course, I'm thinking of subject matter that you might want to investigate in the future, because I would never tackle a book like this. It's daunting for me to look at it and read it, and of course I relish it because it's delicious, every story. But so much work went into this. And I was thinking about a friend of mine that called me the other day who showed me, he didn't show me, he said, Gordy, you know everybody. I hate it when people do that because I can't remember most of the people I know. He's been working with a local library for years, and he said, we came across this old photograph from 1943. We have no idea what this is all about. It looks like a cowboy, and he's got this hat on, and it says 1943. I said, no name on it? And he said, yeah, but nobody's ever heard of this guy. His name was Eddie Alexander. I said, Eddie Alexander was a dear friend of mine, a Carolina mountain boy. I knew him right up to the moment he died at age 90. I've written about his family and his widow in my ghost book and yada, yada. He said, you know him? I said, yeah. I got all of his old recordings from the old radio shows back in the 30s and 40s. And I said, if you can get a copy of that picture, and I can bring it to that widow who's 87 years old today, imagine what an impact that'll have on her. Chances are she never saw that publicity photo because radio was king back in 1943. And so, you know, those are stories about the old radio entertainers here in the North Country that would make.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Before we get back to the book, I just want to let people know that you market things in a different way than the average publishing company, and that you don't deal as much with bookstores as you do with other businesses.
And you know, when you look at it now, you'd say, well, that's probably a good thing, considering,
well,
considering what's happened to
with
bookstores.
Borders Books and others.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I decided, as part of that St. Mary's upbringing, you know, about trying to do something for other people.
We keep going back to that, don't we?
Well, I do. I try to, you know, make sure people know what you're getting into, that it's risky, and the same thing with selling. Rather than have the money go to Borders and have the money go elsewhere, I'd like to see it local, and the small stores, grocery stores, anything, I'd like to support them. So, in any given week, I might take off. I might do it this week. I'll go. My typical round would be Cornerstone Books in Plattsburgh.
Our good friend. Thank God Nancy's still alive. Still alive and well, not personally in the store after all these years in downtown Plattsburgh. She's been good to us.
Yeah. I
do a lot of people.
I have books there, and I'll go to Brookside Grocery in West Shazy, Mountain Mart in Altona, Varen's in Ellenburg, and Dick's up in Cherubusco, Dick DeCosta's store. Right One in Chattagay, a little publishing business she has. And I also have a store, Shea Madeline Gifts in Malone. And then I'll stop at Bill's Bait and Beer in Brainardsville. Maggie Pharmacy.
Don't you love these names?
Yeah.
I love it.
Maggie Pharmacy in
part of the
Dannemora.
North Country.
They sell a lot of books for me. Larry Chandley's Pharmacy in Peru sell a lot. So, and Cornerstone in Rouse's Point is one that I do on a separate route. So I have all those stores that are carrying my books, and anybody who publishes through me, if it's about this region, I'll also get their books in there. And instead of the 40% discount, most of my books I'll give the stores $5 for every one they sell. And actually, for many of them, to help out more, even though it might not be good business sense again, is I'll often put the books in for free. They're on a consignment deal. I have paperwork, simple paperwork that I monitor everything with. And I'll go around to the stores, I'll check that I left 10 copies of Terror in the Adirondacks, and now you have 8, so you owe me for 2. I'll do that with all the books every so often. And that way, I know that I'm helping a lot of these small stores, at least in a small way, $5 or $10 or $20 a week, and it's spread all across the area. I originally had about 30 stores, but it became too much at one time. I needed to control it better, which now I have much better control of it, so I can do it with a store that's a distance away and still manage it just through email, and I can mail books to them. So that's how we distribute our books.
So it's possible that somebody watching this program away from this area might say, hey, how do I get Larry's books in here?
Right.
How do they contact you?
Well,
If somebody wants to.
anywhere on the Bloated Toe website. It's the 3 W's, bloatedtoe.com, but we have an extensive website with publishing pages. We have a store. There's plenty of email contacts, sales at Bloated Toe. And if you navigate through the site, you'll find stores. There's a listing of where each book is available, because sometimes a store might be more geared towards certain books and not others.
Certainly.
So I'll do that. But I've actually had, and this has happened again recently, where people in the store, like in Brainardsville, will comment that someone came down from Malone to get the books, because until recently I was out of Malone again. I had been in there for a few years, but they read on the site where to find it, and then they'll drive to Brainardsville to buy some books. He actually sells quite a few books there. It's a very small store, just a
Isn't
quick
that
stop
neat?
for sandwiches and things.
So, I'm sure other people do that elsewhere with other small publishing companies, but you've developed your own way of doing things.
Right. Another one I should have mentioned is Conroy Organics.
Oh, my
because
goodness, yes.
I do.
I'm going up there for a book signing in November. You can believe that.
Well, because of the loop that I travel, and it's well over 100 miles, I have a secondary route, and that would include usually Conroy's, and when I head towards Rouse's Point down to Cornerstone. Conroy's is a good example too of what's happened. When I first went in there, Simon's got it's a beautiful place. I just love the store, and he's got a beautiful cafe area, and there's some bookshelves, and you could go in and eat, and you could grab a book to read. And when I approached him about selling the books there, he had agreed, and he told me where, and we set them up on the top shelf. But what happened was people are coming in to eat, and they're just grabbing one of the books that's for sale.
Yeah, look through the book, check it out, get a little coffee,
I stop in
a
next
few
week.
scrambled eggs on it, put it back on the shelf.
Right, but I stopped in next week, and the books are all kind of bent, and there's chocolate fingerprints on some of them. Yeah, so he said, I'll fix it. He put a little sign up telling people these are for sale. So when I started, I had probably 4 or 5 books on his shelf. And now when you go in there, you'll see all my books lined up, and then you'll see probably a dozen or 15 other authors.
Sure.
They've bought the same plastic holders I have, and they're all crowding me. In Brainardsville, the same thing has happened. I've seen it up at Dick's store. So, yeah, people are kind of following what I'm doing, and they're doing it now. It's kind of crowding me out of my own business.
You're the leader. You're the leader, Larry.
Yeah.
Well, and it's nice to know that, just because you write another book and put one out doesn't mean the other ones aren't still selling. And I think we proved that here today. And it's nice to see some of those books where you have to reorder even though you didn't want to go into another printing.
It's a nice problem to have, yes.
It's a nice problem to have. And a lot of those problems that you have are nice problems to have. And I don't want to shortchange you in explaining how hard you work, because I watch you, and I know that you burn the midnight oil, and I kid many times about how you should get an hour or 2 sleep every day at least, because there is frustration involved. Because you work pretty much alone in this business because, if you can't trust yourself, who can you trust? But when you deal with a printer, you deal with people, with writers who hand you a book and say, my son-in-law is a doctor of theology, and he edited this book, so you don't have to do a thing with it. And you open it up and read the first page and find 27 errors on the first page. Yeah. This guy is one of the best editors I've ever seen in my life, and I think that's almost a built-in talent with you, to scan.
Well,
you read this stuff.
We call it copy editing because I want people to know it's if you wrote fiction, I'm not going to look at it and say you need to develop this character more. That's not the type of thing. Of course not. I'm looking more at copy editing, which is again St. Mary's grammar, spelling.
Very, very important aspect.
The nuns were sticklers, and I'll tell you, it's really paid off for me.
So when your book goes to serious readers and they see spelling errors, typographical errors, sentence structure, really, really lousy. But you've developed a huge talent for this, and I don't know how you can read so fast. You've told me how many times you've gone through a book before it's finished.
Oh, 3 or 4 times in a week, too.
In a week. Think about that. Most people don't read that much in 6 months. But anyway, of course there's hard work involved. But the payoff is nice at the other end. There's a certain satisfaction, and not all of it is greenbacks.
No,
There's a great satisfaction in putting a book like this out and knowing what went into it and have people look at it and say, Larry, this is unbelievable. Can you sign this book right here? And put... So anyway, there are stories in here I want to mention to people because I want to get them excited about going out and buying 4 or 5 copies before Christmas time. There are stories I'm always interested in, and as we are, have a morose interest in tragedy, right? Mm-hmm. And when I saw the picture of the Titanic and your story about how we have a local contact with the Titanic, I said, is it true?
I just couldn't believe it when I found it.
What's that all about?
And what's really great is somebody snapped some pictures and
don't
actually
you
have
love
the
it?
pictures in there because that ship was, any tie I can find to the area, that ship was known as the Plattsburgh
Yeah.
at one time. And as the Titanic was first being launched, this was one of the ships docked, and the Titanic was so, as you would say, Titanic. They didn't know what would happen as it moved, and the huge waves, even at slow speed, and it caused damage on some of the docks nearby, and one of the ships swung out, and it just came. When they say within 100 feet was so close, it would have been tragic. This was within a few feet, just a very few, like 4 feet maybe, and somebody snapped pictures of it. And if that had hit, the Titanic would have had to stay. They wouldn't have left. So they definitely would not have had happen what did happen.
Isn't that amazing?
Something else may have happened, but that ship was involved, and it was just so close, and that's what some writers have actually mentioned. If only they had hit. The reaction was to try to prevent it, and who knew?
When you just talked about that, I talked about a stupid phrase that we use all the time, and it's near miss. I mean, it sounds like an oxymoron to me.
It never made sense to me.
But people use that all the time. There was a near miss at the airport today.
It was a near hit, maybe. But a near miss is a hit.
Let's talk about some of these other stories,
Okay.
because I know you are so excited. We're talking about fiddling a few minutes ago.
Well, that very first one, actually, I got a good review on that one already. That was very important because I talked to my mom, and I told her, I said, just enjoy it. So pick your way through. But one of the first stories she read was the first chapter about Lafayette Spaulding. He's an old-time fiddler. And there are a lot of old-time fiddlers, of course, but first of all, I just love the name.
Oh,
I
God.
had no idea there was a story, but I researched everything I could find on him, and eventually he made it to Broadway on a whim. When he was an older guy, somebody saw him, and they said, we could really use him in this play, and it was just a tremendous story. But for Mom, it was the old-time fiddler. Anytime there's a barn dance, that's the guy you would call down in the Crown Point area. And he would, he had his little idiosyncrasies, and one of them was he wanted to be, before I play, I need to be in my position, and that was on a table. He had to have a chair set up on the table, and he'd play the fiddle, and the other thing was he had this thing that they just said was hysterical, was everybody's out there dancing, and he'd stop everything and make a big show of correcting you, and everybody's just laughing, and that's why they wanted him so much. He put on a great show, and that's how he became connected with Broadway, and they used him in a play about country folk, and that they actually let him do his own thing, and it was a hit. It was actually a hit in New York City. I thought that was amazing. I didn't know anything about this guy. And there's a modern day fiddler, like I say, is carrying on the tradition now, a young girl.
Isn't it great? Yeah, 15 years old, just fantastic. Is there more than one railroad story in here?
I don't.
I remember one or two railroad stories you were talking about. Which was the one?
There's one out near, generally in the Old Forge area.
Yeah.
There was a big train accident there. And it took a while on that one to research the whole story. Newspapers gave the overall story, but thank goodness I kept digging, because there are people that work for the New York State Library System and for other outfits, and they're scanning stuff that a lot of us might think is worthless, but a lot of that is what goes into these books. And at some point, they had to investigate this accident, and the accident report showed what happened, and it was just a terrible thing, because 2 trains hit when one was supposed to pull off. As a child, I always heard about side rails, but I never really knew. Nobody explained that. Well, the train goes by, but because these trains are going in different directions, somebody's going to need to pull over and wait on the side rail till they pass, and that's sort of what happened here. But when the message came through, they delivered it to the engineer and to the people that needed to have it. Unfortunately, at some point, when he took it out to check it, his thumb covered part of the message.
So that's the errant thumb, huh?
And that's what happened. And that caused the trains to collide and killed people, and it was just a terrible accident.
You know, you mentioned Chateauguay, and every time I hear Chateauguay, it's connected with a different story. How does such a little tiny, and you mentioned that here, how does such a little tiny place produce so many interesting people and places? I mean, we've been down there to do several television shows based on famous things that came out of there, but how many people will remember the racehorse?
And see, I remembered the racehorse. I kept remembering seeing that name Chateauguay, and I never knew anything
too,
about
but
it.
I never made the connection until you started writing about it.
Well, I read the Daily News every day. My dad used to read it every day at lunchtime, and I always read it. And you'd see the horses' names in there, and I even read all. I was a voracious reader, so I would even read all that stuff about the horse races and the bets, first, second, and third, and all that. So I remember seeing that name, but finally researching the story, I was amazed that it really was tied to the village of Chateauguay. And this guy was one of America's richest men, and that he was connected through the mines. Actually, I didn't know that at first. It was through his partial ownership of some of the mines in Mineville and Line Mountain, and he saw that name and just thought that would just be like a wealthy guy would do. What a cool name for a horse. And then the horse went on to great fame, almost won the Triple Crown, actually. And he was in touch with the village after he even wrote a letter of thanks for their support.
And the reason Chateauguay is so cool because I watch and listen to new reporters on radio and television who come into this area, and they try to say
Try to pronounce it.
Chateauguay,
Yeah.
or they try to spell it.
Yeah.
Which is a whole different ball game entirely.
Sure.
And a lot of the communities, the spellings of their names, like Plattsburgh. As a matter of fact, I was watching, and this is no indictment on television especially, but we all watch a lot of television and so on, promoting a big event here. And the big event was at the Creech Center in Plattsburgh, Plattsburg.
Mm-hmm. Now, you might find that...
Somebody paid a lot of money for that advertising.
What I did in the book sometimes, if it was an old-time story and that's when Plattsburgh didn't have the H,
Sure.
then I may have gone with it in the chapter because that was actually correct at the time.
Of course.
But most times I'll,
Well, that's not surprising to all of us who've studied that story over and over and over and over again. Well, anybody would be fascinated by hearing stories about strange animals who end up in the Adirondack region, and we've talked about cougars and mountain lions until, almost ad nauseum, to quote an old phrase. But did we ever have alligators up here?
Oh, yeah. That's just something you don't know. Alligators in the Adirondacks. You really don't expect that, but research shows many times they've been found, and a few aren't really explained yet. There were several that were brought up as novelties or as pets, and then when it got maybe 3 or 4 feet long, somebody cut it loose somewhere. There was one that was actually, nobody has explained that one. I don't think they ever found the source. Usually someone would come out later to admit, I've had that thing for 3 or 4 years. Some guys were hunting down in, I think, the maybe Hamilton County area, and they saw near a dam, they saw this large creature in there and realized what it was, and they killed it. They actually shot it. And but the other one was, the big one I thought was just tremendous, was the story of Lake Placid. They had animal collections there, so they did have alligators, but there was one originally that was given as a gift to the guys that ran the hotel, and it was small, and they just let it loose on the beach, but the thing was there for a couple of years. People would see it. And then there was the other one where a guy actually...
Yeah, sure, just let it go. It'll be all right.
Well, the guy came up from Florida, and he actually had one. People helped him capture this thing, and I think, I don't recall if it was 7 or 8 feet long, and he straps it to the side of his car and drives home from Florida with the gator strapped to his car. So these are all, there actually were alligators at some point in the Adirondacks.
We've had strange animals here. There was a place called Land of 1,000 Animals. Does anybody remember that place?
I remember that, yeah. I used to see that sign. I used to beg to go there.
And I ran into 400 old slides from many, many years ago, my own slides, and I found a way to digitize them now. And here we are with a whole stack of stuff from the Land of 1,000 Animals. And my kids would, like you did, begged to go
Oh,
and see all
I
these
love the
animals. But as we've heard some national stories lately, these animals can get out. And when I hear stories about people who raise, Bengal tigers in their 47th floor apartment in New York City, and the thing swats them and knocks the side of their head off one day,
But I did a chapter on bird attacks.
Oh,
Now, like
gosh.
I said,
Here we are with birds now. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, there's serious history.
That's
but,
a good one.
To me, that is part of history. But, as I did it, you're reading about as someone's working on the farm. And, if you ever worked outdoors like that for a long time, you realize stuff like that really does happen. That hawks really aren't that impressed with you, and they might swoop down to grab something right in front of you. So, that's happened many times. But then when I read a story where he had battled, this might be 120 years ago, he battled these big hawks many times, and they're stealing chickens, and one day they come along and grab his child and lift her up and drop her on a nearby building, and I'm thinking, okay, this is pretty far-fetched. So, I worked on that whole chapter and got those stories together. I want to include that, but I don't want to necessarily say it was true.
I love the illiterate title, too.
Yeah, Furious Foul Forays.
Say that 3 times.
But, just to be safe, I did a little research on the internet, and then you're just amazed at what you find there. If you search on YouTube, you'll find, in fact, when I did the story online, I put a link to it, where these eagles swooping down and grabbing mountain goats, and some of these aren't just young ones, they're good-sized animals, bigger than a young child.
Sure.
And they'll grab them right up there, and you can watch them fly away with it, and it's just, then you realize grabbing a baby wouldn't really be that difficult, especially where it was just an infant sitting there in the grass while mom's working in the garden, and this is in a country place maybe near Watertown 100 years ago where there's mostly wild animals. So things like that did happen, things like that are documented, and a lot of people were injured by hawks and eagles when they swooped down to attack and try to steal chickens or something.
I keep going back to
Amazing to me.
Alfred Hitchcock's Birds.
Yeah,
and how, I got a son that's 50 years old who still doesn't like it when birds swoop down anywhere close to him, wherever he is. So, yeah, we all think about birds. Just a couple more quick things. The dueling sheriffs of Hamilton County.
That was a story that, just something catches your eye, and I wanted to know what was going on with this dispute over the election. This is, I don't remember the year, but it's a long time ago. And the guy that ran for office didn't have any opposition, but there was a local guy very popular, and back, politics were pretty important back then too, and the other party wanted their candidate, so they convinced a guy to, go ahead, put my name. So it was a write-in thing. Well, it shocked everyone that the write-in candidate won. But then the other guy started to fight back and said, I want the job, I'm staying on the job, and you're not really elected because those votes don't really all have your name on them. And what triggered this with me right away was the election in 2010 up in Alaska. I don't know if a lot of people follow the news about this, but it was a big deal because I think it was Joe Miller was clearly expected to win, and Lisa Murkowski was a write-in candidate. And she won, except it just happened to be Joe Miller made the same claim that this sheriff claimed, that, well, you're a write-in candidate. Now, this candidate down in Hamilton County won by total votes, but he was known by his first initial with his last name, or 2 initials, or by a nickname. So he had about 5 or 6 different names that he was voted for under. So the other sheriff said, then you have to divide those and you have to separate them because each person's different, and that means the other sheriff actually did win the election. And I just wrote in there, first of all, it's a crazy idea, because Alaska's a perfect example. If you're Miller and you're running against Murkowski, what are the chances you're going to spell Murkowski right? So that just eliminates any chance.
Especially me, if you know me. Thank God for spell check.
Like, what would the Kowalskis done in Line Mountain?
Think about it.
They'd never get elected.
And all those other people we know and love up there.
So, and actually, that story did play out to where the guy that won it with all those different name votes, but they were clearly intended for him, he threatened to sue the county, saying that those are my votes, and I'll have you bring in every person in the county, which is a huge expense. And then there was a physical takeover of the jail twice. That's what was going on. So I wrote that whole story. It just really amazed me that it could happen, but it really happened.
You know what? There are 50 plus. I do love the cover, so I think you got it right. People are going to say, wait a minute, that's 50. is centered, but the plus sign is.
I know that.
I love it. I absolutely
Well,
love it.
another
if you can get
publisher-
people to talk about the cover before they even open the book, then you've done something.
There was a friend of mine, another publisher, and she said, "Oh, what about this here?" And I said, "Well, actually, the 50 is supposed to be centered over the subtitle, which it is." I said, "The plus was just my idiot idea that it's really 51, so we're going to put a plus on it." I thought it looked cool,
I love
but
it.
she thought then it looked off-center.
Adirondack and North
Oh,
Country
wow.
Gold 50 plus new and true stories you're sure to love. Lawrence P. Gooley, Bloated Toe Enterprises. Go on the Bloated Toe website, order copies of my book and everybody else's book here. And
sure.
we'll all have a really good Christmas this year. Larry Gooley, I want to personally thank you for your friendship, for your help in my own writing efforts, and for everything you do. You have earned a niche. So 100 years from now, somebody else will write a book called 7,000 New and True Stories, and there'll be a chapter about Larry Gooley in there. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
You're the man. Thank you so much for everything.
Oh,
Good
thank
luck
you.
for everything in the future, and you know that I'll be in touch with you.
Oh, I'm sure.
Thanks to all of our viewers for watching this program number 1, for chatting about it, for seeing it on the internet at Plattsburgh.com and HometownCableNetwork.com, and for your suggestions about topics. We love to meet new people and talk about new things and new books. And send your checks to Calvin Castine in terms of $5,000 increments would be very nice to on the Ridge Road in Champlain. And I like to say at the end of every show, who knows where we're going to be next time for our little corner.